dear students, this is Kripalini welcoming you all for our lecture series on agrochemicals and pest control. The topic for today's discussion is pesticide residue in soil. Pesticides are synthetic organic chemicals used to control weeds in fields and lawns and unwanted or harmful pests such as insects and mites that feed on crops. Pesticides are divided into categories according to the target organisms they are designed to control. When a pesticide is released into the environment, many things happen to it. Sometimes the leaching of herbicides into the root zone can give you better weed control. Now and then, releasing pesticides into the environment can be harmful as not the entire applied chemical reaches the target site. Pesticide characteristics like water solubility, tendency to adsorb to the soil and pesticide persistence and soil characteristics like clay, sand and organic matter are important in determining the fate of the chemicals in the environment. Movement of pesticides from the sites of application to non-target regions creates three problems. It represents an economic loss to farmers, inefficient control of pests and possible environmental contamination. To make better understanding of the subject, the topic can be studied in the following subunits. They are initial distribution of pesticides, environmental impact of pesticides on plants, environmental impact of pesticides on soil, movement of pesticides in the environment via the soil, and pesticides and human health. So, first we will take initial distribution of pesticides. Initial distribution describes the proportion of pesticide that is on or in the air, soil, water, plants and animals after application and affects fate of a pesticide in the environment. This amount is determined by the formulation, method and rate of application as well as topography, amount and type of vegetation, ground cover and weather conditions. With time, the pesticide may be redistributed within the application site or may move off site beyond the edge of the target area or bottom of the root zone. Pesticides that move off-site represent an economic loss and may pollute groundwater or surface water. Persistence. Pesticide persistence is often expressed in terms of half-life. This is the length of time required for 1/2 of the original quantity to break down. For example, if a pesticide has a half-life of 15 days, 50% of the pesticide applied will still be present 15 days after application and half of that amount will be present after 30 days. In general, the longer the half-life, the greater the potential for pesticide movement. Pesticides can be divided into three categories based on half-lives. They are non-persistent, moderately persistent and persistent. Non-persistent means pesticides with a typical soil half-life of less than 30 days. Moderately persistent means pesticides with a typical soil half-life of 30 to 100 days. The third one, persistent. It means pesticides with a typical soil half-life of more than 100 days. Persistence is affected by photodegradation, chemical degradation and microbial degradation. All three processes may participate in the breakdown of a single pesticide. The rate of degradation depends on pesticide chemistry as well as on environmental conditions. Distribution between foliage and soil as well as temperature, soil and water pH, microbial activity and other soil characteristics may affect pesticide persistence. Next is mobility. Pesticide mobility may result in redistribution within the application site or movement of some amount of pesticide off-site. After application, a pesticide may attach to soil particles, vegetation or other surfaces and remain near the site of deposition, or it may attach to soil particles and move with eroded soil in runoff or wind, or it may dissolve in water and be taken up by plants, move in runoff or leach. Otherwise, it may volatilize or erode from foliage or soil with wind and become airborne. Mobility is affected by the pesticide sorption, water solubility, vapor pressure and other environmental and site characteristics including weather, topography, canopy, ground cover, soil organic matter, texture and structure. Next, move on to environmental impact of pesticides on plants. Research in the fields of metabolism and the environmental behavior of pesticides has developed into interdisciplinary cooperation in which pesticide chemists cooperate with agricultural chemists, soil scientists, microbiologists and plant physiologists. All the process which takes place in the soil plant system after the application of pesticides is of particular interest for agriculture. The ultraviolet fraction of sunlight is absorbed to considerable extent by many chemical compounds, providing the energy necessary for photochemical reactions. Similar decomposition reactions take place during chemical and biochemical modifications in which microorganisms, plant roots and soil macrofauna are involved. Absorption and fixation processes have an influence on the availability of active substances in the soil for treated cultures and subsequent untreated crops. Factors which influence leaf uptake and metabolism of pesticides are physicochemical behavior, formulation, droplet size, application technique, precipitation or rainfall and relative humidity, temperature, sunlight, plant species and physiological differences, example stomata, upper or lower leaf surface, hairs, waxes and time of application during the vegetative period. Similarly, factors which influence root uptake and degradation of pesticides in soil are physicochemical behavior, application method and amount, physicochemical and biochemical reaction in the soil, climatic factors and plant development. The degree of plant uptake is determined partially by the pesticide's water solubility. Plant uptake of pesticides prevents runoff or leaching. Next is volatilization from foliage. Pesticides also may volatilize or be blown away by the wind. Volatilization from foliage is determined by the pesticide's vapor pressure, which is affected by temperature. Higher the temperature, greater is the volatilization. Pesticides on foliage are more susceptible to volatilization after application because over time pesticides become incorporated into surface waxes. In general, pesticides with vapor pressure index value of less than 10 have a low potential to volatilize. Pesticides with vapor pressure index value greater than 1000 have a high potential to volatilize. Next is absorption. Absorption is the uptake of pesticides and other chemicals into plants or microorganisms. Most pesticides break down once they are absorbed. Pesticide residue may be broken down or remain inside the plant or animal and be released back into the environment when the animal dies or as the plant decays. Some pesticides stay in the soil long enough to be absorbed by plants grown in a field years later. Now we can concentrate on environmental impact of pesticides in soil. In this we have adsorption, sorption, degradation or breakdown processes and volatilization from the soil. First one is adsorption. Adsorption is the binding of pesticides to soil particles. The amount a pesticide adsorbs to the soil varies with the type of pesticide, soil moisture, soil pH and soil texture. Pesticides are strongly adsorbed to soils that are high in clay or organic matter. Most soil-bound pesticides are less likely to give off vapors or leach through the soil. They are also less easily taken up by plants. For this reason, you may require the higher rate listed on the pesticide label for soils high in clay or organic matter. Next is sorption. Sorption describes the attraction between a chemical and soil, vegetation or other surfaces. However, sorption most often refers to the binding of a chemical to soil particles. Pesticides that are sorbed to soil particles are more likely to remain in the root zone where they may be available for plant uptake and microbial or chemical degradation. Sorption is influenced by soil moisture, organic matter content and texture. Pesticides are more readily sorbed onto dry because water competes with pesticides for binding sites in moist soil. Organic matter and clay particles both have plenty of surface area and are chemically active. Soils high in clay and organic matter have a high potential to sorb pesticides. Clay content is also important for holding organic matter. Sand particles provide less surface area for sorption. Generally, soil-bound pesticides increase with time. This in turn corresponded with a decrease in extractable residues. It means the more pesticide is binding to the soil organic matter, the more time after the application. Coming to degradation or breakdown processes. Degradation is the process of pesticide breakdown after application. Pesticides are broken down by microbes, chemical reactions and light or photodegradation. This process may take anywhere from hours or days to years, depending on environmental conditions and chemical characteristics of the pesticide. Microbial degradation is the breakdown of pesticides by microorganisms such as fungi, bacteria, and other soil microorganisms. Soil organic matter, texture, and site characteristics such as moisture, temperature, aeration, and pH all affect microbial degradation. Microbial activity usually is maximum in warm, moist, well aerated soil with a neutral pH. Microbial breakdown tends to increase when temperatures of warm soil pH are favorable, soil moisture and oxygen are adequate, and soil fertility is good. Microbial degradation occurs at a higher rate in the surface soil horizons, particularly in areas with high organic matter. Usually, the rate decreases with depth in the soil, where conditions such as moisture, temperature, and aeration are less favorable for microbial activity. Chemical degradation occurs when a pesticide reacts with water, oxygen, or other chemicals in the soil. As soil pH becomes extremely acidic or alkaline, microbial activity usually decreases. However, this condition may favor rapid chemical degradation. Chemical breakdown is the breakdown of pesticides by chemical reactions in the soil. The rate and type of chemical reactions that occur are influenced by the binding of pesticides to the soil, soil temperatures, and pH levels. Photodegradation is the breakdown of pesticides by sunlight. All pesticides are susceptible to photodegradation to some extent. The intensity of sunlight, length of exposure, and properties of the pesticide affect the rate of photodegradation. Pesticides that are applied to foliage or to the soil surface are more susceptible to photodegradation than pesticides that are incorporated into the soil. Pesticides may break down faster inside plastic covered greenhouses than inside glass greenhouses, since glass filters out much of the ultraviolet light that degrades pesticides. Next is volatilization from the soil. Volatilization is the process of solids or liquids converting into a gas which can move away from the initial application site. This movement is called vapor drift. Vapor drift from some herbicides can damage nearby crops. Volatilization from moist soil is determined by the moisture content of the soil and by the pesticide's vapor pressure, sorption, and water solubility. Pesticides volatilize most readily from sandy and wet soils. Hot, dry, or windy weather and small spray drops increase volatilization. Where recommended, incorporating the pesticide into the soil can help reduce volatilization. The rate of volatilization of pesticides from soil depends upon properties of the chemicals and of the soil. On the other hand, post-application volatilization represents further significant pesticide input into the troposphere for several days or weeks after application. The dominant factors that affect volatilization from soil and crops are vapor pressure, Henry's law constant, that is Kh, characterizes the tendency for a pesticide to move between the air and the soil water. The higher the Kh, the more likely that a pesticide will volatilize from moist soil. Next is movement of pesticides in the environment via the soil. In this, first way is through erosion. Erosion means soil particles which are transported by wind and water, pesticides attached to soil particles. Soil loss through wind erosion may transport herbicides to non-target areas. Incorporation may reduce herbicide concentrations at the soil surface, reducing loss on wind erodible sediments. There is potential hazard of environmental transport of herbicides in wind-blown sediment, which may have implications for air and water quality. Wind erosion events affect air quality. If dust containing pesticides is inhaled, there may be an impact on human health. If the dust is deposited in waterways, then there may be a detrimental effect on water quality. Surface applied herbicides are absorbed to soil particles in the very shallow surface layers, which is the first to be removed by wind erosion. Hence, the potential for removal of surface applied chemicals by wind erosion is much higher than soil incorporated pesticides. Incorporation increases herbicide efficacy. Therefore, potential transport of soil incorporated herbicides by wind is much lower than that of surface applied herbicides. Erosion has detrimental effects on the economics of agriculture and the environment. During the dust storms, high amounts of radionuclides, heavy metals and residues of pesticides are transferred by the wind and contaminate the agro landscapes. Research was conducted on the physical and chemical parameters of soils susceptible to wind erosion. Clay and microaggregates smaller than 0.01 mm content are the main soil parameters influence the level of erodibility of soil by wind. Increase of clay and microaggregate content leads to decrease of erodibility. There are many other problems caused by wind erosion which affect the environment. The behavior of contaminants such as remains of fertilizers and pesticides is different in various environments and perhaps depends on the binding of contaminants with soil particles. Next is leaching. Leaching is the downward movement of pesticides in the soil through cracks and pores. Soil normally filters water as it moves downward, removing contaminants such as pesticides. Soil and pesticide properties, geography and weather can influence the movement of pesticides. Pesticides that leach through soils may reach groundwater. Soil properties, pesticide properties, pesticide application and weather conditions are the factors of affecting leaching. As a summary, the behavior of pesticides in soils is governed by a variety of complex dynamic, physical, chemical and biological processes including sorption, desorption, volatilization, chemical and biological degradation, uptake by plants, runoff and leaching. These processes directly control the transport of pesticide within the soil and their transfer from the soil to water, air or food. The relative importance of these processes varies with the chemical nature of the pesticides and the properties of the soil. Coming to the last subunit, pesticides and human health. Pesticides have been linked to a wide range of human health hazards, ranging from short-term impacts such as headaches and nausea to chronic impacts like cancer, reproductive harm and endocrine disruption. Chronic health effects may occur years after even minimal exposure to pesticides in the environment or result from the pesticide residues which we ingest through our food and water. A July 2007 study conducted by researchers at the Public Health Institute, the California Department of Health Services and UC Berkeley School of Public Health found a six-fold increase in risk factor for autism spectrum disorders for children of women who were exposed to organochlorine pesticides. Pesticides can cause many types of cancers in humans. Some of the most prevalent forms include leukemia, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, brain, bone and breast, ovarian, prostate, testicular and liver cancers. Studies by the National Cancer Institute found that American farmers, who in most respects are healthier than the population at large, had startling incidences of leukemia, Hodgkin's disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and many other forms of cancer. There is also mounting evidence that exposure to pesticides disrupts the endocrine system, causing mess with the complex regulation of hormones, the reproductive system and embryonic development. Endocrine disruption can produce infertility and a variety of birth defects and developmental defects in offsprings, including hormonal imbalance and incomplete sexual development, impaired brain development, behavioral disorders and many others. Examples of known endocrine disruption chemicals which are present in large quantities in our environment include DDT, lindane, atrazine, carbaryl, parathion and many others. Multiple chemical sensitivity is a chemical condition characterized by the body's inability to tolerate relatively low exposure to chemicals. This condition, also referred to as environmental illness, is triggered by exposure to certain chemicals and or environmental pollutants. Exposure to pesticides is a common way for individuals to develop multiple chemical sensitivity, and once the condition is present, pesticides are often a potent trigger for symptoms of the condition. The variety of these symptoms can be dizzying, including everything from cardiovascular problems to depression to muscle and joint pains. Over time, individuals suffering from multiple chemical sensitivity will begin to react adversely to substances that formerly did not affect them. For individuals suffering from multiple chemical sensitivity, the only way to relieve their symptoms is to avoid those substances that trigger adverse reactions. For some individuals, this can mean almost complete isolation from the outside world. Finally, I can say that the movement of pesticides through the soil structure and into the groundwater proceeds by an array of pathways. Consequently, the inhibition and control of pesticide movement can be difficult to implement. Through this difficulty, it has been experienced that the most effective route to pesticide control is through best management practices. So students, I hope you have some useful information in this episode. Thank you so much for watching this session. Hope we will meet in the future episode. Until then, take good care of yourself and bye for now.